Let's talk Red Sox Yankees. Of course, rivalries here in the U.S. in all of our professional sports. Lots of history to this particular rivalry. Lots of players that have played on both sides of this rivalry. We're just looking at one here. Johnny Damon switched sides in an interesting cover in the Sporting News. But let's jump right in. All right, so originally this rivalry was known as, maybe even before it was actually a rivalry, was the Highlanders versus the Americans. If you read the chapter associated with this rivalry in our Rivals book, maybe you recall which team was which here. Any guesses, or do you remember the correct answer during this time? The Yankees were the Highlanders, and as you might have guessed, the Red Sox were the Americans, given Boston's history with our founding of America itself. And we know that the Red Sox actually developed from the Reds, or the Red Stockings, the first professional franchise in our metropolitan area, metropolitan Cincinnati. The owners, the Wright brothers, actually moved that team to Boston, and they were the Americans and then later the Red Sox. And the Yankees actually started out, believe it or not, as the Baltimore Orioles until they were moved to New York in 1903 and became the Highlanders. And then later the Yankees. Now, typically, I like to, try and remain neutral. I'm your professor in these rivalries, but I have a somewhat of a rooting interest in this particular rivalry. I've got to go with, yes, the Red Sox. I lived in Massachusetts. I got my PhD at the University of Massachusetts. I've been to several Red Sox games, not including the Yankees. I've never seen them play live against the Yankees at Fenway. But I was at several Red Sox games against other opponents where the chant erupted, "Yankees suck," even though they were not playing the Yankees. So an interesting personal story there. Talking about the history, getting back to the history between these two franchises and this rivalry. The author used the term in the Rivals book, the symbiotic relationship between the owners. And we've heard this term come up. This is the third or fourth time we've heard this term come up talking about different rivalries. We heard it come up, or it comes up with El Clasico. It comes up also with Montreal Canadiens versus Toronto Maple Leafs. So this is kind of a common theme that seems to go between the rivalries, is this idea of a symbiotic relationship, meaning the two franchises are intertwined with each other. And in this case, the author is using that term to describe the relationship between the owners of the Red Sox and the Yankees. And it was very one-sided, the movement of players early on in the history of this rivalry. Where were players moving? Which team were they moving from and to? Well, probably the most famous transfer of a player was Babe Ruth. Transferred from the Red Sox to the Yankees, and that was generally the direction that all of these players were moving. Any sort of Red Sox player that became pretty good or was somewhat of a star got sold to the Yankees, as the Bambino did. Although he was sold at a price much higher than most players, $125,000, which would be, I don't know how much today, but a lot. And consequently, as you might imagine, one team dominated the other team within this rivalry through most of the history. The Yankees buying all of the Red Sox good players meant that the Yankees dominated the rivalry itself through most of the 1900s. The Yankees, during a particular period that was highlighted in the chapters, then in the 1920s through all the way to the end of World War II, the Yankees won 10 World Series titles in a span of about 20 years. So not only did they dominate the Red Sox, but they dominated the entirety of Major League Baseball. So that leads to this question: do you have to have parity between the teams for it to be considered a rivalry? There's some pretty funny quotes that we'll talk about in just a minute, where the Yankees players and even some of their management sort of deny that it's a rivalry with the Red Sox because they always beat them. And they say, well, how can it be a rivalry because we always win? So we're not even concerned about the Red Sox at all. You can imagine from the Red Sox side that, yes, they saw this as a huge rivalry, right? As the Yankees is the biggest threat to them, not only taking their good players, but also beating them consistently on the field. And, of course, you've got some other elements contributing to the perception of this as a rivalry, which we'll get into in just a second. So during this time, Tom Yankee of Yankee Way, one of the streets that borders Fenway Park, bought the Red Sox, and he bought the team in 1933, and he started to invest much more in the team itself and enable them to keep some of their superstars through his long tenure as owner. We still saw some superstars going from the Red Sox to the Yankees during his ownership, but you started to see the Red Sox starting to exert their franchise as a top franchise in their own right during his tenure as owner. He also put money into Fenway. There was a huge fire before he bought the team in Fenway, and part of the stadium was damaged, and he put investment into Fenway to make it the iconic ballpark that we think of it as today. And then later John Henry buys the franchise in the 2000s and renovates Fenway even further to create some of the modern revenue streams that we think of with stadiums today and enable Fenway to continue as the ballpark for the Red Sox. But getting back to Yankees' ownership term, he added investment to the team so that it wasn't quite the little brother to the Yankees that it had been before he became owner, but he brought another problem to the Red Sox that plagued them for decades and decades. Both competitively on the field it was a problem, but also off the field it was a problem, and that problem was his southern racism that he had. He refused to sign black players or consider black players for a long period of time. And even after the team was integrated, years after other franchises had already integrated, that stigma stuck with the Red Sox, in that free agents of color did not want to go and play on the Red Sox because of that long history of racism that Yankee and his family had sort of stained the Red Sox with. And from a competitive standpoint, you have to, and I'm going to use my chalkboard for a second. It's hard in any sport to remain competitive if you're only recruiting from a subset of the possible population of major league players, right? So I'm going to create a quick chart here. We're going to create a Venn diagram, or I'm going to create a Venn diagram. So let's say this is the population of all possible Major League Baseball players, meaning they have the talent to play Major League Baseball, right? And let's say that, for the sake of argument, let's say that you've got, this is back in history, you've got this part of the talent pool is white, and this part of the talent pool is colored, or black specifically. He discriminated against. So if you're only recruiting from this portion of the talent pool as a team, you're naturally going to be at a disadvantage from other teams that do not hold your discriminatory preferences and are willing to recruit from the entire talent pool, right? Because they just have a recruiting advantage or a human resources advantage in that they're not going to discriminate on skin color, which has nothing to do with your actual performance on the baseball field. Right? So anytime in any sport that you discriminate on a trait that doesn't have to do with performance on the field, you're putting your team at a disadvantage. And one of our other rivalries that we talk about in this class, the Canadians and the Maple Leafs, for a little while, the Canadians discriminated against Anglophones, so English-speaking players, and they really focused on just French-speaking players, and that put the Canadians at a disadvantage for a short period in their history. So getting back to Red Sox Yankees, fortunately, over the course of time, that stigma and that discrimination went away from the Red Sox, and the ownership group integrated, and now they're under a new ownership group. As I mentioned, John Henry bought the team in the 2000s and renovated Fenway even further. So let's go back to the 70s, when the Red Sox were trying to rise out of the Yankees' shadow, if you will, and there were two particular players that played a major role in this period in the rivalry. Carlton Fisk, on the one hand, which was the famous Red Sox catcher, captain of the team, and Thurman Munson, the famous catcher for the Yankees. Thurman Munson from Canton, Ohio, my hometown. And these two, he was the captain of the Yankees, and they were both all-stars as well. So you have two players that play the same position. They're the captains of their teams, and they ended up getting into fisticuffs quite a few times. You see a picture there in the top right of a collision at home plate that led to a bench-clearing brawl in 1973, and we're going to watch a short video here of another bench-clearing brawl, also involving Carlton Fisk as the instigator, and this one is from 1976.
Well, the Yankees, and there they go again. Mickey Rivers right in the middle of it. Mickey Rivers is the guy that's trying to hit everybody with a sucker punch. He's not getting anything. He just ran around behind everybody trying to hit him in the back of the head. I see Samlins in there. I saw Velez in here. And Rico is going berserk now. Things have gotten out of hand here at Yankee Stadium. And Bill Lee is really hurt.
Alright, so you get the idea there. Some of you were probably wondering why I was letting the video continue to play there after the first part of the fight broke up, but as you saw, they weren't done fighting. So it gives you some of the flavor of the rivalry just from that period in the 70s and how much they did not like each other. 1978, there was a one-game playoff because the teams were tied at the end of the regular season. The Red Sox were up 2-0 in the sixth, but went on to lose. And then again, we had some comments from the Yankee players after that game that we knew we were going to win. We never lose to the Red Sox. You know, they'll always be sort of second fiddle to us or little brother to us, which of course incites the rivalry even more. And that was their first, that 1978 one-game playoff was their first playoff meeting since 1949. Of course, they're in the same division during most of that period, so they couldn't meet in the playoffs. Here's one of the quotes that I was mentioning from Yogi Berra, the famous Yankees player and then later manager. Relax, we've been playing these guys for 80 years, they're never going to beat us. Which then led in 2003, Larry Lucchino, one of the part owners of the Red Sox, referred in a press conference to the Yankees as the evil empire. And that phrase caught on, and we still hear lots of people in Red Sox Nation, including players in the current ownership group, refer to the Yankees as the evil empire. Then, getting into the 2000s, and some of this history you may recall from when you were a kid perhaps. 2003, the Yankees and Red Sox meet in the American League Championship Series. Game 3, it's tied 1-1, and we will look here and see what happens.
Third, nobody out, and this is over the head. Actually, must have hit the bat of Kareem Garcia, and a foul ball, and Garcia immediately pops up and screams at Martinez.
Yeah, that was perilously close to his head. Martinez hitting Soriano and Derry.
Excuse me, I said the game was tied 1-1. The series is tied 1-1 at this point, and it's game 3.
Jeter, the last time the Yankees and Red Sox played a 2-1 game won by the Yankees back in August. Now Joe Torre,
Well, they warned both benches.
I guess it must have hit the helmet. I thought it hit his bat too.
I thought it hit him in the back.
Really?
It was behind his head.
Well, Martinez now pointing. That's the wrong thing to do. That's inciting right there. Trying to get himself under control.
Now Ramirez.
That ball's not even close.
You talk about looking for a reason.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Don Zimmer and Pedro Martinez. Oh.
That's awful.
Don Zimmer, a 72-year-old man, went into Pedro Martinez's face, and Pedro Martinez threw him down.
That's terrible. Awful. That was absolutely awful.
Before the start of the bottom of the 9th inning, we've had another ugly incident as a fan out above that Yankee bullpen has jumped down in there. Police responded immediately, as did the bullpen staff for the Yankees. And it looks like what could have been.
I don't really understand why, if you're a fan, you would ever want to jump into a brawl with a professional athlete. But that aside, you can see from the video here, or remember from the video, this particular fight that happened between the two clubs. This is again back in 2003. And the Yankees go on and win the series in 7 games, and again hold the Red Sox down, right? Like holding down your little brother. And then after this postseason, the two teams compete with each other for Alex Rodriguez, right? Who was at the time playing for the Rangers and was one of the best players, if not the best player in baseball. There is a 30 for 30 short that's about 22 minutes that describes the whole situation that happened. But to sum it up, the Red Sox actually signed Alex Rodriguez to a contract. The Red Sox GM at the time was Theo Epstein, which a lot of you will recognize that name, the youngest GM in baseball history. He had signed Alex Rodriguez, but then the Players Association would not approve the contract. And in the time during the dispute between the Players Association and the Red Sox about whether it was a legal contract, basically the Yankees swooped in and got Alex Rodriguez to sign with them. Even though at the time, Alex Rodriguez was a shortstop, and the Yankees had a pretty good shortstop, which hopefully most of you will recognize was Derek Jeter, if you follow baseball at all. And this just adds fuel to the rivalry, right? Because it seems that the Yankees are signing Alex Rodriguez just so that the Red Sox don't get him. And they subsequently move Alex Rodriguez to third base after Aaron Boone gets hurt, who was a star in that 2003 series that the Yankees won in the Game 7 victory because of an Aaron Boone home run, I believe. So this happens in the offseason, this battle for Alex Rodriguez after the Red Sox had lost in 7 games to the Yankees in the ALCS. Then the next chapter becomes this subject of this documentary that I've assigned for you to watch in relation to this rivalry. 4 Days in October, and many of you perhaps have seen that 30 for 30 documentary about the 4 days in October in 2004 that really turned this rivalry around. You had the Red Sox in a huge deficit in the series. They come all the way back to win the ALCS and go on to the World Series and win their first World Series in about 100 years for the franchise. And then they later, a few years later, go on to win another World Series. And like I said, turn the narrative of this rivalry around, get the Red Sox out of the Yankees' shadow somewhat in recent times. So let's talk about why this is a rivalry, right? We've got certainly, I'll start our list with star factors. We saw just in the few clips that we watched there, and of course many of their other stars featured in the 4 Days documentary, but just in the clips we watched, we saw Roger Clemens, we saw Pedro Martinez, we saw Carlton Fisk, we saw Lou Piniella mentioned, we saw Thurman Munson, we mentioned him. So tons, as you know, if you're any kind of a baseball fan, tons and tons of Hall of Famers and stars within these two franchises. We also watched a couple of what might be considered defining moments within this rivalry. Things that future players and fans will point back to and say, I remember in 2003 when there was that huge brawl between Martinez and Don Zimmer, where he threw down Don Zimmer, or when Manny Ramirez charged Roger Clemens on the mound in that 2003 series. I remember the big Red Sox comeback in 2004, right? Just as two examples of the defining moments between these clubs. In this particular rivalry, we have lots of frequency of play between these two teams because they're in the same division, and they, in the last couple decades, they've met several times in the playoffs as well, which contributes to the rivalry. We have recent parity in this rivalry, meaning that both teams have been pretty good recently in this particular rivalry. Let's add relative dominance, and that of course would be the Yankees have dominated the Red Sox historically over the long term. So even though there's been recent parity, I think that relative dominance of the Yankees contributes to this rivalry without a doubt. Geography is another one. So we haven't talked that much about geography in our discussion of this rivalry, but certainly you have a little bit of a rivalry of these two cities, Boston and New York. New York being the bigger city, perhaps more cosmopolitan and more of a worldwide city, but Boston being more historical, right, and having the huge role in our country's revolution. And so those two differing histories and their relatively close location geographically lead to them being rivals as cities, trying to sort of dominate the Northeast or be the tourist destination in the Northeast. So several factors going into this history that contribute to the history between these two clubs and add to the intensity of the rivalry itself. If you haven't already, make sure you watch that 4 Days in October documentary, which I think you'll find highly entertaining, as well as learning more about one of the biggest defining moments in this particular rivalry.